Hello and a very warm welcome to the Big Points F1 podcast, the podcast that goes hand in hand with our F1 Top 10 Predictors game. Beta testing for that coming soon, hopefully, so watch this space. We've been having a lot of fun with the game, though, this season, trying to predict our top 10s and a little bit more. We didn't have too much luck with that in Monaco, but we're here to preview the Barcelona Grand Prix. Although, actually, now the topic of Monaco's come up, this is a race that has kind of spilled over into the Barcelona Grand Prix because as testing for Barcelona begins, Pierre Gasly has been given his third place back from Monaco. I don't remember ever a time when a penalty has taken so long to actually be sorted out.
This is crazy stuff, isn't it? I was saying last time on the pod that it's simple calculations of speed equals distance over time. And actually, I think whilst we were recording the pod, they were out there, the Alpine mechanics, measuring the distance. But you're right, it's taken best part of a week for this to come through, for them first to accept it and then to actually kind of say, yes, okay, we were incorrect. So someone said it's the longest VAR, and I think so. Are we going to have Gasly back on the podium this weekend doing a solo celebration? Maybe not, but he certainly deserves it.
There's a gap, isn't there, coming up soon? And all the drivers live in Monaco anyway, so I imagine they should have like a little party for him next to the Monaco podium, you'd hope. Because he was robbed of that unique opportunity to be on that proper podium, you know, with the royalty and everything.
Yeah, you sort of feel for Gasly in that sense, but then you just sort of do feel that, you know, justice has eventually been done. But it is quite astonishing, you know, in just before FP1 today, Steve Nielsen, who's the managing director of Alpine, was saying to Sky this, I think it's the first time he's ever got any points on a Friday, which is absolutely mad. And he was also very adamant that he is contacting people at Red Bull to find out where the trophy is, because Alpine are very adamant that they want it back. Apparently it's in Milton Keynes, so if anyone going through any sort of airports close to Milton Keynes headed for Barcelona see someone with like a Louis Vuitton case, you know, there's probably a third place Monaco Grand Prix trophy in there. But yeah, I mean, this took me completely by surprise. You know, I thought the FIA would hear Alpine's case and go, "Yep, look, we get it. You're annoyed. We've got this wrong, but you know, sort of live with it." But you know, the fact that they have waived his penalties when so many other drivers, you know, got and served penalties for the same thing. Let's see if there are any more protests, because apparently these penalties are still appealable. The sort of window for appeal hasn't closed. So, you know, there's, you know, Russell, Hamilton, Piastri, you know, maybe Bottas won't bother, but you know, yeah, watch this space, because you know, there's this finishing order of the Monaco Grand Prix could rumble on.
Maybe it's still not finished. You'd imagine Hamilton won't appeal, given that they served their penalty and it kind of didn't cost them anything. They ended up where they were. I'm really pleased for Pierre Gasly, it has to be said, because I don't think it was a particularly deserving podium for Adjar. Like, he had a good weekend, you know, but he certainly didn't really deserve to benefit and get third place. So I think Gasly was a more deserving podium winner. The interesting thing for me in this is that Alpine clearly never gave up hope. They did this all the right way. Yes, they got out and measured the pit lane, but also I think the basis of their argument was just their telemetry data was just like, look, we know and we can prove that Gasly was at 59.5 and no higher for the whole length of the pit lane, which makes me think presumably it's the same for Piastri, the same for Russell, the same for Hamilton, et al. But Piastri, yeah, I think McLaren have appealed it, but they've appealed the right of Gasly's result to be overturned rather than the right to sort of check into Piastri. So I'm getting a bit confused with it, but it's a crazy situation, isn't it?
It is, and you got to almost worry about the precedent it's setting. Are we going to see this issue, which I know a lot of football fans have argued against, with VAR kind of elongating goal celebrations or pausing goal celebrations? Do we now need to worry that if we have a race on a Sunday, that we then need to keep our finger on the pulse and read the news every day until the following week before we can truly celebrate? I mean, yes, Hadjar is probably, and I agree, is not as deserving as Gasly, but he was in the right place at the right time. He drove a good enough race to capitalise on what at the time was a mistake by Alpine and 5 other drivers. But yet now he's kind of having that taken off him. I think a lot of people across F1 will be concerned about this. And hopefully it's just a blip. Hopefully it's something that we're not going to see again. But I mean, we're going to touch on some other issues in this pod about the FAI maybe not getting things right. And actually, there are humans at the back of it at the end of the day. And I think these issues and mistakes are going to continue to happen. Let's just hope that it means that we're still able to celebrate someone winning a race or getting on their foot on the podium on the Sunday, and we're not going to have to watch our backs.
Yeah, it is, as you say, a difficult precedent. You don't want to be mixing things up too much in terms of what the fans feel on a Sunday when you've seen the checkered flag fall. I don't feel too sorry for Hadjar, I've got to say. But on the operational side, I just wanted to mention a few things. Because operationally, Antonelli obviously drove a fantastic weekend, but Bono, did you hear the radio messages from Bono, his race engineer? Because his race engineer had the wherewithal during the race on Sunday to say, look, lift, mate. When you come in, when you exit, lift in the pit lane, do an extra lift. Because it was like he knew something was going on. And then you see the Alpine team who managed to get Gasly to not serve his penalty so that he could cross the line third. That gave them the chance then to do this appeal and win this place back. And then you contrast that to Russell, whose race engineer didn't even know whether he'd actually served his penalty correctly or not. When Russell was kind of asking about it and saying, look, what can I do? Did we do it? Did we not do it? Russell's engineer didn't know. And then Russell spotted another hole later on where he's like, look, I can serve it now and it's not going to cost us much, if anything. Let's get it done. And they said, oh, no, we think we've done it. We're not sure. We were stationary. So they were all question marks for Russell. And then you see what difference it makes when Antonelli's race engineers operating at a fantastic level, the Alpine team plus their lawyers operating at a fantastic level. It makes a difference down the stretch. And Russell will be feeling particularly annoyed about this because once he'd got the drive-through, no chance for anything to be undone now. Even if everybody does get their penalties taken away, the damage is done for some of the drivers. Damage was done in Monaco as well for Perez. And before we move to Barcelona, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Perez. Really tough stint at the end of his Red Bull career. Looked like this was a guy on the way out, career kind of done. He never lost faith in himself. He's come back with Cadillac. He's absolutely had the beating of Bottas so far this season. He so nearly picked up a point in Monaco, which ultimately was also ended by penalties. But just the fact that he was in that position to kind of sweep up the point that might have fallen his way, that shows what a brilliant job he's doing this season, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, Perez has been, one of these characters who every time he seems like he's down and out and he's lost his seat and he doesn't have one, he picks one up. It happened towards his end of his career. Was it Racing Point? And he was off contract, nowhere for him to go, and he goes and gets that sensational win, either Bahrain or Sakhir, I can't remember which one, but gets us, and which convinces Christian Horner that he's the man, for Red Bull for that second seat, sort of right at the sort of death of the season. He gets a drive, and then is part of, a big part of the reason for that 2021 Max Verstappen World Championship. And say what we want about the controversy at the end, but Perez did his job in sort of backing Hamilton up for a very long time in that race, really played his role well. And things went a bit sour at the end of Red Bull, and but he's come back with Cadillac, and it's great to see him on the grid. So almost a point last weekend, win for Mexico last night in the World Cup. So I'm sure he's going into this weekend with a lot of confidence and a lot of happiness.
Yeah, it just makes me feel a bit sad because I do feel like Cadillac might not get another chance to win a point all season. It was kind of executed to perfection and it still didn't work out. But one of his biggest strengths, Perez, has been his tyre management. And to take things to the Barcelona Grand Prix coming up, tyre management usually kind of a big factor around Barcelona, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at, was it C2, C3, C4, the tyre compounds, so kind of bang in the middle on a course which is not kind to tyres. A lot of lateral force is going to be going through those this weekend, and it's going to be a hot race if kind of history and the forecast are correct. So yeah, Perez's tyre whispering will hopefully see him in the right place. I'm hoping at the right time. Maybe that's 10th place at the end of the race. I think a few things will have to happen for that to come through. But I think it's going to be really interesting seeing Perez versus Max, who is perhaps notoriously not a tire whisperer. I think Red Bull have done very well in previous years to get a car that manages to keep the tires on when Max is absolutely throwing it around these corners. So maybe we'll even see a Perez Max little battle going on in the midfield. I would love that for one.
I'm not putting that down in my predictions, it's fair to say. But I noticed from last season, in the end, Verstappen was our big point scorer in our game for 10th place. You get 10 points if you predict 10th correctly. So that's a really important position for us in the game. And Verstappen was 10th in Barcelona last season. None of us would have had that down, I am pretty sure to say. The winner was Piastri. It was Piastri, Norris, Leclerc on the podium. Russell ended 4th, Hülkenberg 5th, Hamilton, Hadjar, Gasly, Alonso, Verstappen in the top 10. So Verstappen, Alonso and Gasly, the big three. Gasly, you can see him being there or thereabouts again, but Verstappen ending down in 10th. At first you scratch your head and you think, how did Verstappen, with the pace he had last season, end 10th? And then you remember why it happened and you think, oh yeah, that was pretty big, wasn't it?
Yeah, Verstappen had one of his sort of red mist issues last year where he pushes the line, in most races, like all great champions do. But I think last year was somewhere where it just got the better of him and he stepped over it. He had an incident where I think he'd had to go off track and cut a corner and then give a place back to George, and then in that sort of switchback, that he wasn't very happy with the way George did that, and then he basically deliberately drove into the side of him during that incident, which is just one of the biggest no-nos in Formula One. So yeah, slam dunk penalty for Verstappen there, and criticised post race and during the race, rightly so. And then that sort of caused the sort of Max and George beef that sort of then rolled on through the rest of last season, and less so into this season, but it's still, I think there's still no love lost there between those two, I think.
They looked all friendly today in Barcelona as they arrived, which is quite a contrast from Russell not sitting next to Verstappen at the only empty chair at the Christmas party or whatever it was last year. But that was a crazy incident. To the fact that he deliberately steered into the side of him. I know Verstappen rightly got sort of panned for it, but I hesitate to say it. I actually don't think he got enough stick for that. That is really something. We saw Vettel do it lightly kind of to Hamilton in Baku a few years ago, also absolutely awful. You just cannot be using your car like that. But to kind of allow somebody to go by and then torpedo them at the side, can you imagine if Russell had retired from that race? Can you imagine how big that would have been if Russell had picked up damage or something? It was a very controversial incident, it's fair to say.
And it's one of those ones where, like, the FIA always say they penalise the incident and not the result of it. But you sometimes have to kind of, it raises eyebrows, I think, because I can't imagine if they'd have both gone off, that the penalty would have been the same, right? I mean, obviously you can't have the same penalty because Verstappen would have retired. But I think you can't have drivers threatening to crash other ones out, because it just has such a massive knock-on effect with, well, what's going to happen next time someone tries to go past. And I mean, we already see drivers, I say drivers, mostly George Russell, but talking about how aggressive Max Verstappen is in corners, in racing, and that's part of what makes him such a phenomenal racer. But if he's also blurring these lines between legal and illegal moves, that just makes it even harder to challenge someone like him.
In fairness to Verstappen, this is very much a blot on his copybook. This was like way beyond the line, and he's been a master, as other, as Schumacher, as Senna were, at sort of blurring that line, being right on the edge of the line in his robust defensive moves and all of these sort of things. He's always been the one, and I think it's unfair to sort of criticize some of the other drivers for like calling for penalties and stuff these days as well, because Verstappen obviously did that too and knows exactly how to do it, to sort of make it look like, or make the odds of somebody else getting a penalty a bit higher. Mm-hmm. He mastered that against Norris for a long time, and then the balance sort of turned in the end. But that is not the only big incident. It is certainly the biggest incident in the last few years at Barcelona. But if I think back, there were some other pretty significant collisions at Barcelona as well, weren't there?
Yeah, so I think the biggest in recent memory has to have to go back to 2016 and the height of the Mercedes dominant period where they had Hamilton and Rosberg both fighting for the title, and Rosberg's seemingly eternal battle to eventually finish above Lewis at some point or the other, and yeah, this race was probably the start of their relationship, and that season at Mercedes really becoming difficult, their relationship falling apart. One of those incidents in Formula One where teammates are just then completely not on the same page, and really battling each other. So yeah, Hamilton had qualified on pole after Rosberg had dominated most of the races prior, so it was a big opportunity for Hamilton, but there's a long run down to turn one at Barcelona, and Rosberg managed to get a jump and sweep round the outside to take the lead. Then a couple of corners later, who's at fault here? We're not, I think they're probably both at fault, really. I think
10
Rosberg,
years later, we're still not sure.
Exactly. Yeah, I think Rosberg was definitely, you can see if you look at Lewis's onboard, Rosberg's charging something on his battery. It means he doesn't have quite have the pace. Lewis has got a tremendous drive out of the corner. Rosberg tries to block him off, or cover his overtaking line, pushes Lewis onto the grass. He loses control. They both crash out, and you get that iconic image of Lewis careering into the grass with his hands over his eyes in his helmet, because he knows what he's done. He's done the ultimate no in Formula One, which is do not take out your teammate. And yeah, an absolute disaster for Mercedes, and maybe a bit of foreshadowing as well, because that ended up being Max's first win in Formula One, and that was sort of a bit of a maybe Star Wars Darth Vader moment, where the first time that you see this sort of youngling becoming a real force of nature. But yeah, a huge incident. I think Rosberg and Hamilton were made to pay for all the damage as well. I think post-race, Nico Rosberg said that cost him about 350,000 euros, which is not a cheap repair bill by anyone's stretch of the imagination. And then I think they both had that clause then written into their contract, so they were made to sign by Toto going forward. So basically, if you hit each other again, we're going to be sending you the bill. So yeah, a pivotal point in that season, and yeah, one of the most iconic of the last sort of 10 years.
That was really the flashpoint in such a long-running rivalry, wasn't it? Rosberg was in a great position, as you said, in that season, and ultimately the double DNF served him okay. But I remember I saw afterwards, more recently, Hamilton was saying oh, Niki Lauda came up to him afterwards and was like, "Did you see that the light was flashing?" He said, "Yeah, of course I did." "Did you see he was derating? He didn't have the charge." He was like, "Yeah, I noticed." It's like, "Then why did you go to the inside? You should have just passed him on the outside," which is a very typical sort of dry Niki Lauda analysis of just Lewis, you should have done it better. But that was an amazing flashpoint when the tensions were so high, and it awoke this beast of Max Verstappen, who reigns supreme to this day. I shed a little tear when I saw the teenage Max Verstappen winning. It was his first race with Red Bull, and he won it. And I was sort of gutted for Ricciardo, but yeah, it was an emotional moment. It was incredible.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You look back, and I'm sure Max would have won another race. And I mean, he did go on to win other races, right? But it's like the what if? What if they hadn't crashed? What if Lewis had gone round the outside, as Nicky suggested, and he'd won that race? Would Hamilton then have won that championship? Would he be an 8-time champion? Would he be a 9-time champion? Because Max Verstappen never goes on to win. Ifs, buts, and maybes. Most of them probably not true, because
2 Daniel Ricciardo titles maybe in there.
Hopefully, I would.
The alternate universe.
I'd take that.
Perez, the number 1 driver at Red Bull.
Yeah.
Who knows? What have we got to look forward to this weekend, or which other favourite Barcelona memories do you have that spring to mind?
I wouldn't say necessarily a favourite, but I think one of the most iconic, sort of etched in my mind from my earlier days of watching Formula One, was in 2001. Sort of similar to what we mentioned with Senna in Monaco last week, of him having a lead from P1 or leading completely blown. 2001, we had Mika Hakkinen, who was 42 seconds ahead on the final lap of the race and only had 5 corners to go, and then had a most tremendous hydraulic leak which caused a clutch failure, and him blowing up on the last race handed a victory to Schumacher, and absolutely heartbreaking for Hakkinen because he was wonderful that weekend, but it also did lead to one of the most iconic Formula One photos of that early 2000s, because on the sort of cool down lap or the in lap, David Coulthard, his teammate at McLaren Mercedes, came round and basically picked Mika up. And you've got the photo there of Coulthard driving with Hakkinen sitting on the side pod and them coming in together as teammates. And also a very gracious in victory Michael Schumacher afterwards, who even went down to the McLaren garage to basically console Mika Hakkinen and say, I don't deserve this whatsoever. So yeah, that was an absolute heartbreaker for Mika, but it did give us one of the great Formula One images.
Classy, very classy. I seem to remember there was one season, was it 2012, when every start, like all of the races at the start of the season had a different winner, and then Maldonado won in Barcelona, holding off Alonso, I think, and then sort of proudly declared afterwards that he wanted to win the world title.
Yeah,
people were like, how are you going to do? What do you think from here? And he wasn't just like, oh no, it was a great result. Really excited about this first win for Venezuela and stuff. He's like, I'm going to be the world champion this year, which was getting ahead of himself a little bit too much, or a lot in this case.
You got to aim high, right? Because I think it was back in Suzuka in Japan that Carlos Sainz was asked, what's your goal for this weekend? And he said, I'm aiming for pole. And this was in the Williams, right? And I mean, kind of harking back, 2012 was the Williams' last victory. So if you don't aim high, if you don't have these aspirations, then you're never going to get there. Are we going to see Carlos Sainz on pole this weekend?
Willie, nothing would be pleased more than a Sainz win and the Spanish Grand Prix for Williams would be astonishing.
Amazing.
But, just watching a bit of FP1, he didn't get out of the pit lane. He not broke down in the pit lane. He had a steering wheel issue in FP1, which was quickly resolved. But then, Luke Browning, who was also one of the, test drivers or young drivers that was in for this session, also didn't even get a lap in because he was replacing Albon and the car had an electrical issue. So got to feel sorry for Luke Browning this weekend. He must have been really looking forward to getting out there, in a Formula One car and then 0 laps done. But that also causes a issue for Williams down the line because they've still got to then find another session for a young driver because it doesn't count because he didn't cross the pit exit. So don't think it's going to be this weekend for Williams, but you never know. Stranger things have happened.
They have indeed. Dan, what are you looking forward to from this weekend potentially? Or if you were to be particularly prescient, what are you thinking might happen?
Well, I mean, Barcelona, as we spoke about earlier, not nice on the tyres. You're looking at a 2-stop, maybe 3-stop strategy for a lot of teams. That's going to mix things up. Unfortunately, as a Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari fan, I don't think it's going to mix it up in the right way for us. But I think it's certainly going to be interesting to see how teams react. I'm assuming most people are going to go soft, medium, hard, or maybe soft, medium, maybe soft, depending on kind of changes. But I think it's going to be those changes, those reactions on if a safety car comes out, if we have incidents, if we are overcutting, undercutting. That's when it's going to be really interesting to see. And maybe we'll see whether Hadjar can kind of replicate what he had last week, back Max up as a true second driver at Red Bull, because that's what they're missing from my perspective, is having someone who can provide that option of an overcut undercut, which is what you're seeing a lot of the time, not consistently yet, but a lot of the time with the top teams, Mercedes, McLaren, and even Ferrari.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's still, we've seen a lot of that this season, haven't we? Where it's been Mercedes, or McLaren, Ferrari, wherever they are on the grid, they're sort of right next to each other. But it still hasn't been the case at Red Bull, which will be a source of frustration for them. Something else that has got Red Bull scratching their heads is apparently that they've been they've come out like in the data as the strongest powertrain, the strongest engine unit this season, which Verstappen said he's going to investigate and go and speak to the FIA in terms of like how did our engine get rated as the best? Like what on what grounds? Which is a very strange thing to say, because normally you'd be parading that really proudly around, wouldn't you?
Yeah. So this is, for context for this is the FIA have been looking at feedback from the teams of these new regulations, and what the teams have been saying is the 50-50 split between the ICE, so the internal combustion engine, your normal engine, and the electric engine, or the batteries. The 50-50 split they've got between the two powers this year is basically, it's affecting mainly qualifying, which we have seen apart from Monaco, with drivers super clipping or whatever you call it, or having to harvest, and these cars slowing down on long straights before you get to the corner, which is not what you want in qualifying. So the FIA have sort of agreed to start moving this ratio more towards a 60-40 over the next, I think it's by 2028, it'll be sort of a 60-40 split. But as part of that process, they have done some analysis on each team's powertrain to then give teams more teams that are behind more upgrades and a bigger spend in their budget cap on their engine. Now, the issue they've raised themselves here is that they've only tested this on the results have been only from the internal combustion engine part of the whole power unit. So according to the FIA, Red Bull have the best internal combustion engine, better than Mercedes and better than Ferrari. But what that means is that clearly Mercedes have the best overall power unit. They've won every race quite comfortably. But what it means is that Red Bull don't have any opportunity, or only have less opportunity to upgrade that this season, whereas every other team has more chance of upgrading. So Mercedes have been given one upgrade this season, and I think one upgrade next season, and also an extra $3 million in their salary, in their budget cap, which just makes no sense whatsoever, which is why Max is frustrated. He's saying, this is a ridiculous test. Why have you tested it this way? Mercedes are now effectively able to catch up on themselves, and surely, having more spend in their budget cap and more opportunities to upgrade just means they're going to get further away from the rest of the pack. So yeah, a baffling decision from the FIA to test it this way. It's one of these things that just makes Formula One just seem ridiculous, especially if you're new in the last couple of years to Formula One. It just makes the sport just look like they really don't know what they're talking about. It's sort of, well, going back to that, what Dan mentioned earlier about humans being in the background behind all of these things, this one's very, very hard to understand. And, you do have to feel for Red Bull, because they are, clearly the fourth best team this year. But now, according to Power, they're actually the best, and, they've got less room to catch up with, Mercedes and McLaren, because they have Mercedes engine, and Ferrari. So yeah, this one's a bit baffling.
Any thoughts to add to that, Dan, or anything for Barcelona before we wrap up?
I guess this is the final thing. This is probably going to be the first weekend where that compression ratio is really going to be tested, with Red Bull and Mercedes going for 18-1 when the engine was heated up, as opposed to the 16-1. So who knows? Maybe Antonelli won't be driving away from the front. I think he will be. But
yes, yeah. I personally can't see anything other than a Mercedes. I don't know. Doesn't really know which Mercedes, but I can't see anything but a Mercedes win.
Russell
this weekend.
Fastest in FP1, but no Antonelli, of course. Still exactly. A lot of questions to be answered. We look forward to seeing how the Barcelona weekend pans out. Once qualifying is done, we will be getting our top 10 predictions in, our first retirement predictions in, our fastest lap predictions in, and we'll be hoping for some big points from the Barcelona Grand Prix this weekend. Enjoy it wherever you're watching. Tom, Sam, and Dan here on the pod. I didn't introduce you earlier, so I'll introduce you before we bow out. But great to be with you to chat F1 again for big points, and have a great weekend, and we'll see each other once the Grand Prix is done and dusted. See you later.
See you guys.